Case 1. Julie Powers Schenecker, the mother who said they talked back. There are crimes that defy understanding. And then there are crimes that reach into something even deeper, something that shakes the very framework through which we understand the parent-child relationship. The case of Julie Powers Schenecker belongs to that second, far more disturbing category. Julie Powers Schenecker was, by all outward appearances, a woman living a privileged and stable life. She was the wife of United States Army Colonel Parker Schenecker, a military spouse accustomed to a certain level of structure and routine. The family lived in a comfortable home in Tampa, Florida, in a neighborhood where children played outside and families gathered for cookouts on weekends. To neighbors and acquaintances, the Schenecker household appeared unremarkable, ordinary even. But behind those walls, something had been unraveling for a very long time. Julie Schenecker had a well-documented history of mental health struggles and substance abuse issues. Court records and investigative reports would later reveal that in the weeks leading up to January 28, 2011, she had been displaying increasingly erratic and alarming behavior. She had been drinking heavily. She had been making troubling statements. And she had been making plans. On January 27, 2011, just one day before the murders, Julie Schenecker drove to a gun store and purchased a .38 caliber revolver. She was recorded on surveillance footage completing that transaction, calm and methodical. The purchase was legal. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her intentions. She returned home with the weapon and she waited. The following morning, January 28, 2011, she shot her 13-year-old son, Bo Schenecker, in the head while he sat in the passenger seat of the family vehicle during what was supposed to be a drive to soccer practice. The boy died instantly. He was 13 years old. Julie Schenecker then drove home, walked back into the house, and went upstairs to the bedroom of her 16-year-old daughter, Calix Schenecker. Calix was sitting at her desk, reportedly doing homework, when her mother entered the room. She was shot twice in the back of the head. She died at her desk, in her own bedroom, in what should have been the safest place in the world for her. Both children were killed within hours of each other. Both were shot execution style. Both were left where they fell. Colonel Parker Schenecker was overseas on military deployment at the time of the killings. He had no idea what was unfolding inside his home. It was not until January 29, 2011, after a neighbor grew concerned and contacted authorities, that police arrived at the Schenecker residence and made the devastating discovery. Julie was found on the back porch, still in her bathrobe, dazed and incoherent. Calix's body was still at her desk. Bo's body had been moved inside. In the days that followed, investigators uncovered a journal that Julie Schenecker had been keeping in the period leading up to the murders. The entries were deeply troubling. In them, she had written about her frustration with her children. She described them as mouthy and difficult. She wrote about her intention to kill them. And critically, in what prosecutors would later call one of the most chilling pieces of evidence in the case, she referred to the planned murders as a way of punishing the children for talking back. She said they talked back. She planned and executed the murders of 2 teenagers because she said they talked back. At trial, Julie Schenecker's defense attorneys argued that she was severely mentally ill at the time of the killings and that she lacked the mental capacity to form the intent required for first-degree murder. They presented psychiatric testimony and pointed to her documented history of mental health treatment. Prosecutors countered with the journal, with its weeks of premeditation, its deliberate planning, its chilling calculation, and argued that whatever her mental state, Julie Schenecker knew exactly what she was doing and chose to do it anyway. The jury agreed with the prosecution. On May 24, 2014, after deliberating for less than 3 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Judge Ashley Moody, who would later serve as Florida's Attorney General, sentenced Julie Powers Schenecker to 2 consecutive life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. In a statement read on behalf of Parker Schenecker and the victim's extended family, the court heard words that no parent should ever have to speak. The family described Calix as a bright and ambitious young woman with her entire future ahead of her. They described Bo as a joyful, sports-loving boy who lit up every room he entered. They asked the court, and the public, to remember them not as crime victims, but as children who deserve to live. Julie Powers Schenecker will die in a Florida state prison. She was 60 years old at the time of her conviction. She will never be free again. Felix Schenecker was 16 years old. Bo Schenecker was 13. They deserved so much more than what their mother gave them. And their names will not be forgotten on this channel. If this case moved you the way it moved us, please take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Every subscription helps us keep telling these stories and honoring these victims. Case 2. Amanda E. Lewis. The punishment that killed a little girl. There is a phrase that investigators and prosecutors in child fatality cases use with uncomfortable frequency. They call it discipline gone wrong. It is a phrase that sanitizes something deeply horrifying. The idea that the murder of a child can be framed, even loosely, as an act of misguided correction. The case of Amanda E. Lewis forces us to examine that framing and reject it entirely. Amanda Lewis lived in Esto, Florida, a small community in Holmes County in the Florida Panhandle. She was the mother of 7-year-old Adriana Hutto, a child described by those who knew her as sweet, energetic, and full of life. By the summer of 2009, Adriana Hutto was dead, and the person who killed her was the woman who was supposed to protect her. On August 16, 2009, Amanda Lewis called 911 to report that her daughter had drowned in the family's above-ground swimming pool. She told dispatchers that the drowning had been an accident, that Adriana had somehow slipped into the water and gone under before anyone could reach her. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but Adriana could not be saved. She was pronounced dead. The story, on its surface, appeared tragic but plausible. Childhood drowning accidents are, devastatingly, not uncommon. But as investigators began to examine the circumstances surrounding Adriana's death more closely, the accident narrative began to fall apart in ways that were impossible to ignore. Medical examiners who conducted the autopsy on Adriana's body found evidence that was inconsistent with an accidental drowning. The injuries they documented pointed toward something far more sinister. Interviews with other individuals who had been present, along with a review of a video recording that would ultimately become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the case, told a story that was entirely different from the one Amanda Lewis had given police. Investigators discovered video footage that showed Amanda Lewis holding Adriana Hutto underwater in the family swimming pool. The footage, combined with medical evidence and witness accounts, painted a picture of deliberate, calculated violence. Adriana had not slipped. She had not been playing and gone under. She had been forcibly drowned by her own mother in what prosecutors described as an act of extreme corporal punishment. The question of what Adriana had allegedly done to provoke this response, if any such question even merits asking, was examined during the investigation. What emerged was a picture of a mother who had a pattern of using extreme physical punishment as a method of discipline, and who on that August afternoon in 2009 had gone so far beyond any recognizable boundary that her daughter did not survive it. Amanda Lewis was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors built their case around the video footage, the medical examiner's findings, and witness testimony. The evidence was, by virtually any legal standard, overwhelming. In what investigators and legal observers found particularly striking, Amanda Lewis was offered a plea deal. She could have avoided a first-degree murder trial by accepting a reduced charge and a negotiated sentence. She refused. She maintained her claim that Adriana's death had been an accident and chose to take her case before a jury. That decision would prove catastrophic for her defense. The trial unfolded in 2011, and the jury heard everything. The 911 call, the video footage, the autopsy findings, and the testimony of individuals who had been present that day. They deliberated and returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. Amanda E. Lewis was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She will never leave that prison. She will grow old and die behind bars, while the daughter she drowned remains frozen in time at 7 years old, a little girl who never got to grow up. Adriana Hutto deserved to swim freely and play freely and live freely. She deserved every single thing that was taken from her. And we will never stop saying her name. Please hit the like button and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited to help us keep honoring victims like Adriana. Case 3. Sheila Agee, the mother who ordered a killing. Most of the cases we examine on Cold Case Revisited involve direct, hands-on violence, crimes where the perpetrator and the act of killing are inseparable. But the case of Sheila Agee introduces a different, and in many ways equally chilling dimension of maternal crime. Because Sheila Agee did not pull the trigger herself. She did something that prosecutors argued was in some ways even more calculated. She used the devotion of her own son as a weapon. Sheila Agee lived in Pensacola, Florida, in Escambia County. Her son, Agee Tisdale, whose name would later become infamous for an entirely separate and equally horrific crime, was deeply connected to his mother in ways that investigators would later describe as extraordinarily influential. Sheila Agee was, by multiple accounts, the dominant force in her son's life. What she wanted, he delivered. The case centers on a conflict involving a woman who was the mother of Agee Tisdale's child. The details of that conflict, the nature of the dispute, the grievances involved, were thoroughly examined during the investigation and trial. What the evidence demonstrated, prosecutors argued, was that Sheila Agee had developed a desire to see this woman eliminated. And rather than acting directly, she encouraged and directed her son to carry out that killing on her behalf. The investigation into Sheila Agee's role was meticulous. Law enforcement reconstructed the communications, the timeline, and the relationships involved and built a case that placed her not as a bystander or a peripheral figure, but as an active and essential participant in the planning of a murder. Prosecutors presented evidence that she had pushed, encouraged, and aided her son in the decision to kill. The Florida legal system recognizes that a person can be convicted of first-degree murder not only by committing the act directly, but by being a principal in the crime, by aiding, abetting, or procuring the commission of the murder. Prosecutors argued that Sheila Agee's conduct met that standard. The jury agreed. Sheila Agee was convicted of first-degree premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case raises questions that extend beyond the individual facts, questions about the nature of maternal influence, about the ways in which a parent's authority over a child can be weaponized, and about accountability. It is easy to look at a person who pulls a trigger and assign responsibility. It is somewhat harder, but legally and morally just as necessary, to hold accountable the person who, from a position of authority and trust, sends another human being to do the killing. Sheila Agee made that choice, and she will spend the rest of her life in a Florida state prison as a result. The victim in this case, a woman whose life was taken because of a family conflict she may never have fully understood was coming, deserved to live. She deserved to raise her child. She deserved every moment that was stolen from her by the decisions made in the Agee household. We remember her here. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Your support means everything and helps us continue this work. Case 4. Natalie Wagner. The unspeakable betrayal. There are crimes that are difficult to discuss. There are crimes that test the limits of what language can adequately describe. And then there are crimes that exist in a category so extreme, so fundamentally violating of everything a parent is supposed to be, that the very act of detailing them requires a kind of moral steadiness that does not come easily. The case of Natalie Wagner is one of those crimes. Natalie Wagner lived in St. Lucie County, Florida. She was a mother, and over a period of time documented by law enforcement and subsequently proven in a court of law, she subjected her own children to sexual abuse that she then filmed and distributed through online networks for the consumption of individuals who sought out child sexual abuse material. We want to be very clear about what that means, because the clinical language of legal proceedings can sometimes obscure the human reality. Natalie Wagner did not simply fail to protect her children from abuse. She was the abuser. She was the one filming. She was the one distributing. She was the one ensuring that the abuse of her own children was captured, packaged, and sent out into a network of predators for their gratification. The investigation that uncovered Wagner's crimes was the result of coordinated law enforcement work involving digital forensics, internet crime task forces, and the kind of painstaking investigative effort that child exploitation cases demand. When investigators traced the online activity back to Wagner and executed a search of her home and digital devices, the evidence they discovered was described by those involved in the case as among the most disturbing they had ever encountered in their careers. Natalie Wagner was arrested and charged with a staggering number of felony counts. The indictment contained more than 80 felony charges, charges that reflected not a single incident or even a handful of incidents, but a sustained, systematic pattern of abuse and exploitation that had been carried out over an extended period of time. The number bears repeating, more than 80 felony counts. She was tried, convicted, and sentenced to more than 21 consecutive life sentences. The sentencing structure was deliberate. It was designed by the court to ensure that regardless of any future legal challenge, any future petition, any future development in her case, Natalie Wagner would never, under any circumstances, be released from prison. 21 consecutive life sentences is not a punishment. It is a permanent declaration that what she did placed her so irretrievably beyond the boundaries of acceptable human behavior that no path back to society could ever be justified. The children she victimized, her own children, carried wounds that no court sentence can heal. The work of Child Protective Services, of trauma specialists, and of whatever support networks surrounded those children after her arrest is the work of trying to undo, as much as humanly possible, the damage inflicted by someone who was supposed to love them unconditionally. Natalie Wagner will die in prison. Every single day of every single remaining year of her life will be spent behind bars. And while that does not undo what was done to those children, it is the fullest measure of justice that the legal system of the state of Florida was able to provide. It is not enough. It is never enough in cases like this, but it is permanent. If you believe in the mission of this channel, telling the truth about cases like this one and ensuring victims are never forgotten, please hit the like button and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited right now. Case 5, Jessica McCarty. 3 children, 1 night, and oh mercy. Some crimes are so staggering in their dimensions that the mind instinctively recoils from the full weight of them. The number 3, 3 children, 3 lives, 3 murders in a single night, is a number that sits in the chest like something immovable when you understand what it represents in the context of Jessica McCarty's case. Jessica McCarty lived in Brevard County, Florida, on Florida's central Atlantic coast. She was a mother of 3 young children, 3 small human beings who depended on her completely, who looked to her for everything, whose entire world was contained within the orbit of the home they shared with her. On the night that law enforcement would later reconstruct in exhaustive and devastating detail, Jessica McCarty stabbed all 3 of her children to death inside that home. 3 children, stabbed by their mother. The investigation that followed was carried out by Brevard County law enforcement in conjunction with the state attorney's office, and what they assembled was a case built on physical evidence, the timeline of events, and eventually the statements and admission of Jessica McCarty herself. The details of what occurred that night, the sequence, the circumstances, the condition in which the children were found, are part of the permanent record of one of the most harrowing child homicide cases in Brevard County history. Jessica McCarty was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. In the legal proceedings that followed her arrest, prosecutors and defense attorneys engaged in the negotiations that are common in capital cases, cases where the state has the option of seeking the death penalty. In Florida, the commission of multiple murders during a single criminal episode is among the circumstances that can qualify a defendant for capital punishment. McCarty faced the very real possibility of execution. Ultimately, a plea agreement was reached. Jessica McCarty pleaded guilty to 3 counts of murder and in exchange for her guilty plea, accepted 3 consecutive life sentences in the Florida state prison system. She would not face the death penalty, but she would never be free. 3 consecutive life sentences for 3 children murdered in a single night. The children's names, their individual personalities, their dreams, the futures that were taken from them in that Brevard County home. These are the things that matter most in this case. The legal proceedings, the charges, the sentencing structure, all of it exists in service of a single fundamental reality. 3 children who were alive went asleep trusting that they were safe, and they were not. Jessica McCarty will serve her 3 consecutive life sentences until she draws her last breath. She will never see the outside of a prison again, and the children she killed will be remembered, here, and by everyone who loved them, for as long as there are people willing to say their names. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. These victims deserve to be remembered, and your support helps us make sure they are. Case 6. Kimberly Mills. The slow death of a 10-year-old boy. If you have spent any time studying child homicide cases, you will have encountered a distinction that law enforcement and prosecutors draw between 2 categories of fatal child abuse. The first is a single catastrophic act of violence, terrible in its own right, but contained within a specific moment. The second is something that many investigators describe as far more difficult to process. The cases where the suffering was prolonged, where the child endured pain, deprivation, and cruelty not for minutes or hours, but for days, weeks, and months. Where there were opportunities, countless opportunities, for someone to intervene, and no one did. The case of Kimberly Mills belongs to that second, more haunting category. Kimberly Mills lived in Tavares, Florida, the county seat of Lake County, situated northwest of Orlando. Her son, a 10-year-old boy who had done nothing to deserve what was done to him, lived under her care. Or rather, he lived under what can only be described as the catastrophic absence of care, combined with active cruelty that medical examiners and investigators documented with a specificity that leaves no room for ambiguity. Kimberly Mills subjected her son to what prosecutors described as prolonged abuse, neglect, and torture. The investigation that followed the child's death, because it was his death that finally brought his suffering to the attention of authorities, revealed a pattern of mistreatment that had been ongoing for an extended period of time. The boy had been denied adequate food. He had been subjected to physical abuse. He had been deprived of the basic necessities that every child requires to survive. He weighed a fraction of what a healthy 10-year-old should weigh when his body was found. The medical findings in this case were, by all accounts, among the most disturbing that Lake County investigators had encountered. The documentation of what this child had endured before his death told a story of suffering so prolonged and so extreme that those involved in the investigation described it as one of the most difficult cases of their careers. Kimberly Mills was arrested and charged with murder and aggravated child abuse. The aggravated child abuse charge, in addition to the murder charge, reflects the legal system's recognition that this was not simply a case of a child dying in the care of a negligent mother. This was systematic cruelty. This was torture. This was a prolonged campaign of violence against a defenseless child who had no one to turn to and no way out. Mills pleaded guilty to the charges against her. Prosecutors sought, and the court imposed, a life sentence, reflecting the extreme nature of the cruelty documented in the case. There is a particular weight that settles over cases like Kimberly Mills's case. It comes from the recognition that somewhere, over the weeks and months that this boy was suffering, there may have been moments where someone could have intervened. A teacher, a neighbor, a family member, a passerby, someone who might have noticed that something was wrong and asked the question that could have saved his life. That is not an assignment of blame to anyone other than Kimberly Mills. But it is a reminder, one of the most important reminders that true crime documentation can offer, that the protection of children is not solely the responsibility of law enforcement. It is a communal obligation. This boy deserved to be protected. He deserved to be fed and cared for and safe. He deserved a childhood. And the person who took all of that from him will spend the rest of her life in a Florida state prison, which is exactly where she belongs. If you believe every child deserves to be protected, please show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to Cold Case Revisited. Case 7. Joanne Zephir, the Bleach Mother. There are cases in this documentary where the method of violence is shocking. And then there is the case of Joanne Zephir, which occupies a category of cruelty so specific, so deliberate, and so grotesque that it has haunted every investigator, prosecutor, and juror who came into contact with it. Joanne Zephir lived in Poinciana, Florida, a community in Osceola County south of Orlando. She was the mother of multiple children, including a 3-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old daughter. In a crime that generated immediate and widespread revulsion when it became public, Zephir forced her 3-year-old child to ingest bleach. Household bleach, the cleaning chemical that carries warnings on its label about the extreme danger it poses if swallowed, was administered to a 3-year-old child by her own mother. The child died. Investigators who worked this case have described the medical findings as among the most disturbing they have ever encountered. The internal damage caused by bleach ingestion in a toddler is catastrophic and extremely painful. This was not a quick death. This was not painless. The 3-year-old girl suffered enormously before she died, and she suffered at the hands of the one person in the world who was supposed to keep her safe from all harm. But the horror of this case does not stop with the death of the 3-year-old. As investigators dug deeper into the circumstances surrounding the child's death, they uncovered evidence that suggested the 3-year-old was not the only target. Authorities determined, based on evidence gathered during the investigation, that Joanne Zephir had also attempted to poison her 8-year-old daughter in the same manner. The 8-year-old had survived, but she had been subjected to the same deliberate and sadistic act of violence. 2 children. The same method. The same person responsible. The question of motive in cases like this is one that prosecutors, investigators, and mental health professionals wrestle with at length. What drives a parent to administer poison to her own children? What psychological framework, what constellation of pathology or intent produces this specific form of violence? These questions were examined in the legal proceedings that followed Zephir's arrest, but they have no satisfying answers, because no answer could ever make what she did comprehensible. Joanne Zephir was indicted on capital murder charges. Given the deliberate, premeditated nature of the crime and the death of a toddler under the most extreme circumstances, prosecutors formally filed notice of their intent to seek the death penalty. This is among the most serious declarations that a prosecutor in the state of Florida can make, and it reflects the assessment of those involved in the case that what Zephir did represented the kind of crime for which no sentence short of death could be considered commensurate. As of the verified information available on this case, Joanne Zephir faced the possibility of capital punishment, a measure of the seriousness with which the state of Florida treated her crimes. The 3-year-old girl who died in Poinciana, Florida, had barely begun her life when it was taken from her. She was at the age where children are learning colors and animals and the names of the people they love. She was at the age where the world is just beginning to open up, and her world was closed permanently by an act of calculated cruelty carried out by her mother. We say her name, we remember her, and we will not stop. Thank you for watching. Please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited so we can keep honoring victims and holding perpetrators accountable. Case 8. Shauna D. Taylor, When Help Became Harm. Within the spectrum of child abuse cases, there exists a subset that is uniquely difficult to detect, uniquely difficult to prosecute, and uniquely difficult for the public to understand. It is difficult to detect because the perpetrator almost always presents as a devoted, concerned, even heroic parent. It is difficult to prosecute because the abuse takes place in medical environments surrounded by professionals who are trained to trust the accounts of caregivers. And it is difficult for the public to understand because it inverts one of the most fundamental assumptions we make about parenthood, the assumption that a mother seeking medical care for her child is acting in that child's best interest. The clinical term for this pattern of behavior is factitious disorder imposed on another, sometimes still referred to by an older name, Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Regardless of the terminology used, the reality it describes is one of the most insidious forms of child abuse in existence. A caregiver, almost always a parent, and in the overwhelming majority of documented cases, a mother, deliberately induces illness in a child, then presents that child to medical professionals as sick in order to receive attention, sympathy, and validation. The child suffers. Sometimes the child nearly dies. Sometimes, as in some cases, the child does die. And the person responsible is the person standing at the bedside, holding the child's hand, being praised by nurses for her devotion and her presence. Shauna D. Taylor was a mother living in Jacksonville, Florida. Her child, a young boy who had been brought to medical attention multiple times for symptoms that doctors were struggling to explain, was at the center of an investigation that eventually uncovered one of the most deeply disturbing patterns of deliberate medical abuse documented in the Duval County area. Investigators and medical professionals, working in coordination, determined that Shauna Taylor had been administering Tylenol and iron supplements to her son, not in therapeutic doses, not as part of any medically appropriate treatment plan, but in quantities deliberately calculated to cause harm. The result was severe liver damage. The child's liver, a vital organ that in a healthy young child should have been functioning perfectly, had been systematically poisoned by the woman who was supposed to be caring for him. The investigation revealed that Taylor's conduct was consistent with a prolonged pattern of what medical professionals describe as doctor shopping, repeated emergency room visits, and the deliberate induction of symptoms in her child. Medical records, reviewed as part of the criminal investigation, documented a history of hospital presentations that investigators came to understand not as the record of a sick child with a devoted mother, but as a record of ongoing abuse carried out in plain sight. Shauna Detailer was arrested and charged with aggravated child abuse. She was convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a sentence that reflected both the severity of the harm caused to her son and the deliberate, sustained nature of the abuse that preceded that harm. The child in this case survived, and that survival, while it cannot undo the damage done to his liver, his health, and the foundational trust that was violated in the earliest years of his life, is something. It is not everything, but it is something. Cases of Munchausen syndrome by proxy are documented in medical literature across the world, and the medical and law enforcement communities have developed increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying them. The case of Shauna Detailer serves as a reminder that these crimes happen, that they are prosecuted, and that even the most sophisticated forms of concealment eventually yield to thorough investigation. Her child deserved to be healthy. He deserved to be safe. And most of all, he deserved a mother who brought him to the hospital because she wanted to help him, not because she wanted to hurt him and be watched doing it. If this case opened your eyes to a form of abuse you may not have known about, please like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Awareness saves lives. Case 9, Sheila O'Leary, death by starvation in Miami. Food is the most elemental thing a parent provides for a child. Before education, before affection, before any of the other complex and varied dimensions of good parenting, there is food. There is water. There is the basic biological sustenance without which a human being, and especially a very young human being, cannot survive. A parent who withholds food from an infant is not making a parenting mistake. A parent who withholds food from an infant until that infant dies is a killer. Sheila O'Leary was a mother living in Miami, Florida. She and her partner adhered to an extreme dietary philosophy that led them to place their infant son on a diet that was, by any medical standard, catastrophically inadequate to sustain his life. The diet was described in court proceedings and medical testimony as so deficient in the nutrients and calories required for an infant's survival that the child's body was effectively starving, slowly, continuously, and painfully, for an extended period of time. Medical experts who examined the infant testified at length about the physiological effects of severe malnutrition in a child of his age. The documentation of what his body went through, the weight loss, the organ stress, the dehydration, the systemic failure that accompanied a body denied what it needed to survive, was presented to the jury in clinical but devastating detail. The child had been wasting away, and the people responsible for feeding him had chosen not to. The infant died. Sheila O'Leary was charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution's case rested on the argument that subjecting an infant to sustained starvation and dehydration, with full knowledge of the child's deteriorating condition, constituted a deliberate act that met the legal threshold for murder in the first degree. Medical experts supported that argument. They testified that the child's condition had not deteriorated suddenly or without warning. The signs of severe malnutrition had been present and visible and progressing. The failure to seek medical intervention, the choice to continue the dietary practice despite the child's worsening condition, was, prosecutors argued, a choice that caused the child's death. Sheila O'Leary was convicted of first-degree murder. She faces an expected life sentence, a sentence that reflects the irreversible and preventable nature of her infant son's death. There is no ideology, no dietary philosophy, no set of beliefs that justifies the starvation of an infant. Full stop. A child cannot advocate for themselves. A child cannot walk to the kitchen and find food. A child cannot explain that they are hungry and that they are getting weaker and that they need help. A child who is being starved is completely, entirely, helplessly dependent on the adults around them to recognize that dependency and honor it. Sheila O'Leary did not honor it, and she will pay for that failure for every remaining day of her life. Her infant son deserved to thrive. He deserved the chance to learn to walk, to talk, to discover the world. He deserved to be fed, and the fact that the most fundamental thing he needed was deliberately withheld from him is a form of cruelty that words will always struggle to fully capture. We remember him. We will always remember him. Please hit the like button and subscribe to Cold Case Revisited. Every view and every subscription helps us bring stories like this one to the people who need to hear them. Case 10. Casey Marie Anthony. The verdict that divided a nation. We want to be completely transparent with you at the outset of this final segment, because the case of Casey Marie Anthony is unlike any of the 9 cases that have preceded it in this documentary. Casey Anthony was not convicted of murder. She was acquitted. And in a documentary that has been devoted entirely to cases resulting in life sentences and permanent imprisonment, her inclusion requires explanation, not as an afterthought, but as a deliberate and considered choice. We include Casey Anthony's case here not because we are asserting her guilt. The jury system of the United States of America returned a verdict of not guilty, and that verdict is a matter of legal record. We include it because the case of Casey Anthony is impossible to discuss in any serious examination of maternal crime in Florida without acknowledging its profound and lasting impact on the law, on public perception, on media coverage of child homicide cases, and on the way in which maternal violence is discussed, prosecuted, and understood in this country. Casey Marie Anthony was 2 years old when she was reported missing on July 15, 2008. More than 30 days after, investigators would later determine she was last known to be alive. She was the daughter of Casey Anthony, a 22-year-old woman from Orlando, Florida, and the granddaughter of George and Cindy Anthony, who raised the alarm when they had not seen Casey for weeks, and when the car Casey had been driving emitted a smell that Cindy Anthony described as resembling human decomposition. What followed the initial missing persons report was one of the most intensely scrutinized, most extensively covered, and most bitterly debated criminal investigations and trials in American history. Casey Anthony's behavior in the 31 days between Kaylee's disappearance and the report, the nightclub appearances, the tattoo reading Bella Vita, meaning beautiful life, the lies told to law enforcement about a fictional nanny named Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, the shopping trips and the boyfriend and the apparent normalcy, generated a level of public revulsion that was instant and overwhelming. Casey Anthony's skeletal remains were discovered on December 11, 2008, in a wooded area less than a mile from the Anthony family home. Duct tape was reportedly in the area of the remains, along with a laundry bag and a blanket. The condition of the remains, due to the length of time that had passed since the child's death, made it impossible for the medical examiner to definitively determine the exact cause and manner of death, though the manner was officially ruled a homicide. Casey Anthony was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated child abuse, aggravated manslaughter of a child, and 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The trial, which began in May 2011 and concluded in July of the same year, was watched by tens of millions of people across the United States and around the world. It generated a level of media coverage that had not been seen in an American criminal trial since the O.J. Simpson case of 1995. The prosecution argued that Casey Anthony had used chloroform to render Casey unconscious and then applied duct tape over the child's nose and mouth, killing her. They argued that the motive was freedom, that Casey Anthony wanted to live the life of a young, unencumbered woman, and that Casey had become an obstacle to that life. The defense argued that Casey had accidentally drowned in the family swimming pool and that Casey's behavior in the aftermath was the product of a dysfunctional family, a history of trauma, and a pattern of dishonesty that had nothing to do with guilt for murder. They raised questions about the evidence, about the scientific methodology used in the prosecution's forensic case, and about the sufficiency of the proof offered. On July 5, 2011, after deliberating for approximately 10 hours and 45 minutes, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty on the charges of murder, aggravated child abuse, and aggravated manslaughter. Guilty on 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The reaction was immediate, visceral, and in many parts of the country, furious. Outside the courthouse, crowds who had gathered in anticipation of a guilty verdict reacted with disbelief and outrage. Social media, still in its relative infancy in 2011 but already a powerful force, erupted. Legal commentators debated whether the prosecution had made crucial errors, whether the defense had outmaneuvered them, or whether the jury had simply been presented with reasonable doubt and done its constitutional duty. Casey Anthony received credit for time served and was released from jail on July 17, 2011, 12 days after the verdict. She left the Orange County Jail in the early morning hours to avoid the crowds. What the Casey Anthony case did. And this is why it is impossible to exclude from any serious documentary about maternal crime in Florida, was fundamentally reshape the conversation around child homicide in the United States. It prompted intense examination of how investigators document crime scenes, how forensic evidence is presented to juries, how media coverage affects public perception and potentially jury pools. It led to what some advocates and legislators called Kaylee's Law, proposals in various states to make it a felony for a parent or guardian to fail to report a child's disappearance or death within a specified time frame. It also, perhaps most significantly, introduced millions of ordinary Americans to the uncomfortable reality that in the criminal justice system of the United States, the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt is not the same as beyond all doubt. Juries can believe that something probably happened, can believe it strongly, and still be constitutionally obligated to return a verdict of not guilty if the evidence does not meet the legal threshold. Whether Casey Anthony killed her daughter is a question that the legal system has officially answered with an acquittal. Whether Caylee Anthony was murdered is a question to which the official record gives a different answer. The medical examiner's determination of homicide stands. Somewhere in the space between those two answers lies one of the most unresolved and deeply felt injustices in recent American criminal history, at least in the eyes of the millions of people who followed this case and who remember, with absolute clarity, the image of a 2-year-old girl with dark curls and bright eyes who simply deserved to grow up. Caylee Marie Anthony was 2 years old. She loved Mickey Mouse. She loved music. She loved the swimming pool where she spent her last known happy moments. She is buried in Florida, and she is remembered, here, and everywhere, and always. If this case affected you the way it has affected so many millions of people over the past decade and a half, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you are watching Cold Case Revisited for the first time today, please subscribe. Caylee Anthony deserves to be remembered. So do all the children in this documentary. And your subscription helps us keep telling their stories. 10 cases, 10 names. 10 stories that represent the darkest possible failure of the most fundamental human obligation. We began this documentary by asking a question that has no comfortable answer. How does a mother become a monster? And having walked through all 10 of these cases together, we are not going to pretend that we have found a clean, satisfying response. Because the truth is that these cases do not fit a single profile. They do not arise from a single cause. They are not the product of a single demographic, a single geography, or a single type of pathology. Julie Powers Schenecker planned her crime for weeks, driven by frustration and resentment that metastasized into something irreversible. Amanda Lewis crossed a line in a moment of violent punishment and took her daughter's life. Sheila Agee used her son as an instrument of murder from a position of maternal authority. Natalie Wagner turned her own children into victims for the consumption of strangers on the internet. Jessica McCarty committed an act so overwhelming in its dimensions that 3 consecutive life sentences was the only legal response the system could construct. Kimberly Mills subjected her son to months of suffering before his body finally gave out. Joanne Zephir administered poison to her toddler with a deliberateness that defies explanation. Shauna D. Taylor weaponized the very act of seeking medical care and turned it into a tool of abuse. Sheila O'Leary denied her infant son the most fundamental thing a parent provides and watched him die. And Caylee Anthony remains the face of an injustice that millions of Americans feel, but that the legal system, as designed, could not remedy. What these cases share is not a single motive or a single method. What they share is the betrayal of children who had no other recourse. Children who could not leave, could not call for help, could not protect themselves, and who depended utterly on the people who harmed them. The purpose of this documentary is not to generate anger, though anger is a reasonable response. It is not to generate despair, though despair is understandable. The purpose is awareness. The purpose is memory. The purpose is the insistence that these children existed, that they mattered, that their lives had value, and that the circumstances of their deaths must be documented, examined, and never allowed to fade into the background noise of a world that moves too quickly and forgets too easily. If you are a parent watching this documentary, hold your children. Tell them they are loved. Keep them safe. If you are a person in a community watching this documentary, pay attention. Child abuse does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes the signs are quiet. A child who flinches, a child who is absent, a child who seems smaller than they should be. You may be the only person in a position to notice. And noticing, and acting, and making the call could be the difference between a child who survives and a child who becomes a name in a documentary like this one. This has been Cold Case Revisited. We are committed to giving a voice to victims, to documenting the cases that shaped American criminal justice, and to ensuring that the names of the children and individuals lost to violent crime are spoken with the dignity they deserve. If you watch this entire documentary, thank you. It means that these children were heard today. It means their stories reached one more person. And that matters. Please take one final moment to like this video. It helps more people find this channel and hear these important stories. Leave your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. We read every single one. And most importantly, if you have not yet subscribed to Cold Case Revisited, please do it right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications so you never miss a new upload. Cold Case Revisited. Because every victim deserves to be remembered, and every story deserves to be told.